The Parallax View, a 1974 film directed by Alan J. Pakula, starring Warren Beatty, is the prime example of what happens when you take a vain, egocentric central actor such as Robert Redford, Kevin Costner, Will Smith, Tom Cruise, and at times maybe even Denzel Washington. But what happens is that these guys can be good actors if they are put into the hands of a really good, strong, altruistic filmmaker. Tom Cruise, for example, with Stanley Kubrick. Robert Redford with George Roy Hill. And most recently, well, not recently, back in 1974, Warren Beatty. I am not the biggest Warren Beatty fan, but I do think that Warren Beatty, if he is under the hands of an extremely well-established, strong filmmaker like Elia Kazan or Hal Ashby and the director of Bonnie and Clyde, he can deliver a full, believable performance. And here he outdoes himself, I believe anyway. Oh yes, and especially with Robert Altman with McCabe and Mrs. Miller. But here he is absolutely terrific, and because he is under the hands of an Oscar-winning filmmaker such as, and also a very not well-known filmmaker named Alan J. Pakula, who made the film Sophie's Choice and All the President's Men, in which he won his Oscar for. But he made a film called, well, he made a trilogy, so to speak, called the Paranoid Trilogy. And the first one being Clute, starring Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda. And then he made the one that I'm going to talk about right now called the Parallax View. And after that he made All the President's Men. But Clute was much more of a claustrophobic film about a sort of noir private investigator trying to investigate a murder that a prostitute is involved in, which Jane Fonda plays. And here he makes a sort of conspiracy thriller in the vein of, say, JFK, but much more quieter and much less dialogue, but in the best possible way. This is a film that sort of traverses into different terrain. It is a film that is the one particular genre but morphs into a different tone of filmmaking and atmosphere purposely, and all in the best possible way, because it has to do with the storytelling itself. This is something that I completely cherish in movies. I look for this in films such as that's why, for example, Eyes Wide Shut is one of my favourite films, because I love how it goes from romantic drama to possible conspiracy thriller. Now, The Parallax View is a full-on conspiracy thriller. It tells about an assassination that happens in the beginning of the movie, which is no spoiler alert, and then throughout the first 30 minutes it's pretty conventional, but it's all shot beautifully in Alan J. Pakula's regular cinematographer, and it's all done in like shadows and really deep, dark, contrasting lighting, lots of brown, almost difficult to see in certain cases, especially when the interior scenes within the characters having a discussion. A lot of the time it's in deep, dark shadows. So try not to watch this film in with the sun out, basically, or at least find yourself in a dark room to see this film. It's also a very cinematic looking movie. There are lots of extended shots, lots of wide frames, and it is all incredibly beautiful to see. But the genius of this film, I'll get to it, is that basically the first 30 minutes starts off as a regular conventional film. Warren Beatty is playing a journalist trying to investigate the murder of his partner journalist, who was also murdered because it was a she who had she was a possible witness into the murder of a political president, which has a lot to do because the film itself is very loosely inspired by the JFK assassination. And what happens is that as he's investigating, the more deeper he gets involved in a company known as the Parallax, and of course he gets too deep into it that a conspiracy thriller begins to entwine. And what happens, instead of a typical regular dialogue driven conspiracy thriller, especially in the 70s, is that it morphs into a almost silent movie in the best possible way. And the fact that it is a full-on movie, well-known stars such as Warren Beatty in the lead, it makes it all the better in that sense. So, so for like the first 30 minutes, there is even an action sequence for that matter, and I was thinking, okay, here we go with the cliche, so to speak. But it turns out it is all done on purpose to trick us into believing that what we are seeing is actually a typical by-the-numbers action blockbuster thriller just before Star Wars. But, like a lot of 70s movies, the pacing is pitch perfect. It's like Mark Kermode once said, is that if you notice a lot of 70s films in comparison to the films made of today, the pacing is like this. Cut, 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 cut. And now it's... right, it's really, really, really fast pacing in comparison as to back then. You will get slow pacing, but a lot of the time they're not house films. So a lot of 70s films that were the blockbusters back in the day before Star Wars appeared were much more superior in pace and tone, and the Parallax View is no exception. So what happens is that as Warren Beatty gets more and more deeper into his investigation as to the murders of the political assassination that occurs in the opening sequence, it morphs into a sort of cryptic thriller with little dialogue and little soundtrack. And there are vivid scenes that occur, such as a brainwash sequence, which I will not spoil, but the thing goes on and on and on, and you wonder where it's going to stop, and it just simply doesn't until it does, and you haven't realised it has, and it's just absolutely terrific, and it's unexpected in a certain sense, and it's not there is no political propaganda shoved down our throats, even though it is pretty much per se a political thriller. It is, you could say, it is the much more mature version of the Jason Bourne trilogy, because it is very twisty and turny, and don't expect a typical Hollywood conventional ending, especially for a film like this. It is a movie from from start, middle, and end, and there is no sequel, and that is terrific. So it is a film that I bought 100%. It is the best way to describe it is that one of my favourite books of all time is called Glamorama, written by Bret Easton Ellis, and that also touches into a conspiracy thriller as well. What I loved about that book, it starts off as a sort of like a modelling agency. It starts off with in the world of modelling in New York, right? And what happens, I'm trying to compare this to the Parallax View. So what happens is that its lead in the book Glamorama gets involved with other models who turn out to be psychopathic terrorists, and that's not spoiling, but from the surface level, Glamorama doesn't start off that way, and we do not think that it is actually a horror film that is going to slowly evolve. But that is not until way halfway through the book, and the book is, pretty thick. It's a pretty big book, and I love when a story sort of morphs into something else completely. When it starts off from one thing, we get sort of bored and sort of like, oh, okay, I see, this is good, this is compelling enough, and then you see, and the Parallax View doesn't necessarily go into shock value such as Glamorama, but it goes into a sort of zone where we wonder, we don't even realise that the dialogue and the more conventional dialogue and the script in comparison to the first half hour of the film is quasi non-existent in the second, and we realise we don't need the dialogue, and that's the genius of the film. And you know what's also absolutely terrific, what I love about this film, it's that we barely, like in a way Nolan's Dunkirk and certain Hitchcock's for that matter, you barely see the villain of the film. There is villains in this film, and you know there are baddies in this film, but what's so great is that they're either shot in absolute, extensive shots, and in bird's eye view, and you barely see them unless they are into the absolute distance or lurking in the shadows. The villain is pretty much mysterious, and we barely see them. And when we ever do see them, they're either steeped in deep, dark shadows, or they're miles away off camera, you see. And we're only focused on the Warren Beatty character, who, for a guy like him, like I said, barely speaks in the second half. So I love the lack of dialogue, and we're just going from frame to frame to frame, slowly trying to figure out what is going on. We know, but we're not quite 100% sure how to pinpoint what is actually going on in the scene that we're seeing. So it's a very cryptic second half in comparison to the first. Not in the same way as a David Lynch for that sense, but yeah, and I just really dug how the film is made. It is made by clearly a master filmmaker, and a really underappreciated filmmaker for somebody who, because Alan J. Pakula died in the 90s from a car accident, you see. But what's so sad is that he's not a very well-known guy from today, and he should be. And this is one of his masterpieces, I believe. So the film is cold, but not like cold in the sense, not too cold in the sense of a Michael Haneke film, to the point that we can't emotionally invest inside its characters, which is what some of Michael Haneke films are for my money anyway. But it is not a sentimental film either, and it is not a Hollywood movie, even though it is an American Hollywood picture. But also that it is uncompromising, unshowy, never too much, and yet never too underneath. It is literally a perfectly made movie in my perspective, and it goes into mysterious territories, and the way it's shot, and it's also in a very intense film for that matter as well, because it becomes a predictable film for the first and morphs into unpredictable because of the smart, wise choice of how the filmmaking aspect is made of this movie. So that is why it's rare for me to give this out of 5, but I'm going to give this film a 5 out of 5 because it is made with craft, it is made with beautiful, crispy, shadowy, dark cinematography. The pacing and the tone, and well, there's a lot of the case of the 70s anyway, and the editing is pitch perfect. It doesn't show us what we should see, and yet it does show us the things that we need to see, but we sort of understand what is going on, if that makes sense. We understand, but we're not quite 100% sure, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. There's a scene in an airplane where the Warren Beatty character is trying to stop a particular bad guy, but it's incredibly intense, and yet everything seems normal by the way the soundtrack is applied. And it doesn't show us barely the villain of that sequence. It's only we're only seeing Warren Beatty's facial expression, and he doesn't pull off much of an expression because he's trying to keep his cool. But you never know whether or not he's going to basically lose it or not. And we never know really that he's going to emotionally break or whatnot. Instead, we are seeing this in a weird way, like a voyeur. It feels, what is also a genius aspect, it feels like the film was shot from somebody following Warren Beatty as a marked man. And we, the audience, are watching from the perspective of the follower, if that makes sense, because nothing is as it seems in this movie. And that is the genius of the Parallax View. So that is why I fully recommend this film. If you are smart, of course. It is not for the senile people who are into Fast and Furious films. Not that is necessarily bad, but let's put it this way. If you are not into great films, not into... if you love the Fast and Furious, for example, and the Transform is to a certain degree. But if you don't like 70s films and think that... Suicide Squad deserves an Oscar for Best Picture and no Oscars for, say, a film like, I don't know, McGabe and Mrs. Miller or The Godfather, then, mate, this is a film that you should basically see. I highly recommend this movie because if you are smart, it is a film that is thought-provoking, it is a film that is mesmerising, but you have to pay attention to what is going on. Make sure you have a coffee and watch it at the best mood possible, and trust me, you're in for a rewarding and thrilling and paranoid experience. It is a remarkable movie, absorbing, unsettling, a paranoid, thrilling experience, and made with craft and mastery, and that is the reason why I give this movie, The Parallax View, directed by Alan J. Pakula, a 5 out of 5. Yes. A rare number for my case because I don't really see a lot of classics lately, but I certainly highly recommend The Parallax View. It deserves what it's got because of its craft and authenticity. And voila. So yes, if you enjoy my review, please subscribe. put a like, and I hope to make more reviews to see more good movies like this, because I haven't much lately. So there you go. Au revoir, arrivederci, ciao.